Well, welcome to the seventh talk on world history, which is about ancient history. And really, the first point to make out is that before 500 BC, our records of the ancient world are very incomplete. After 500 BC, we do start to get much more complete records. Unfortunately, many of the histories that had been written have been lost, and we only really know about them because others have mentioned them. And so, for instance, Josephus will mention several history books when he says, oh, you can find out information from these history books, but sadly they no longer exist. And this is a common theme, that it's not that history didn't exist and there weren't records, it's just simply they were being lost. And so it should be no surprise that when we come to the period of history prior to 500 BC, everything is much more incomplete. So when I come to discuss this period of history, it's going to be much more difficult to pin down exact dates or to say how things happened. But I suppose the first thing they want to look at in terms of this is, going back to the original theme of this series, is the Bible an accurate revelation from God? And to ask that question, we need to think about the Bible itself. How do we know that the Bible is an accurate revelation from God? Well, if you remember, I started off by looking at the issue of miracles and also the issue of fulfilled prophecy. And I'll just bring up the presentation now. And these factors are the factors that inform us about whether the Bible is in fact a revelation from God. When we look at the history, that is a supporting argument that says, yes, we're happy that the Bible is a revelation from God, but we also want to check out that it also fits in with the history. So hopefully this will come up. So if you remember, we said that revelation, the only source of knowledge guaranteed to be true. Our evidence comes from miracles. Now I mentioned the work of Professor Craig Keener. In fact, there's a very good YouTube site that you can go to, which will show you him speaking. And in the last 30 minutes of that YouTube, it's about 50 minutes long, he gives a whole catalogue of miracles that he knows about, which are really give us great faith that miracles do take place today. Fulfilled prophecy, which I personally find a very, very powerful evidence that the Bible is from God. That will be discussed in talks 8 to 12, but there's clear evidence throughout the whole of the Bible that there has been prophecies made in the Bible that have been fulfilled in history. Now I'm going to look at the issue of the balance of probabilities. If we look at early human history, is it more probable that the Bible is true, or is it more probable that it is false? I put into the argument that it could be false, things like carbon-14 in ancient artifacts, which seem to predate the Bible's account. However, on the other side of the scales, I put in information that seems to support the biblical account. So one of the first ones I look at here is that there are tribes around the world that have a common flood story. That is, tribes in Africa, Asia, Australasia, South America, North America, as well as Europe. So there is a clear record from all these groups of people who don't have any particular contact with one another that there's been a flood. And from a historian's point of view, that is very strong evidence. And Nathaniel Jensen's work on mitochondrial DNA I've mentioned before, where obviously it relates to this. You know, if it's clear that the mutation rate in humans is consistent with 6,000 years of history, then that is evidence for the history being consistent with the Bible. Again, we find that the earliest civilizations are found in the Middle East. For instance, the Chaldees, Mesopotamia. That's again consistent with the idea that humans came down, as it were, with the flood and spread out from the plain of Shinar, which is Mesopotamia. Another interesting fact is that the earliest cities are very sophisticated. So if we go to the Chaldees or any of the early cities, we don't find primitive cities, we find sophisticated cities. This is consistent with the fact that humans have always been intelligent, always being capable of great technological skills. It's only really in the last 200 to 300 years that we've seen an exponential growth in that area. When we look at writing, contrary to what the early anthropologists suggested in the Victorian period, that writing didn't exist in the time of Moses, we now discover through cuneiform and other things like hieroglyphics that it did exist going back as far as we can tell. And the writing that exists is very complex. Likewise, the languages, the oldest languages, such as Sanskrit, have a very complex grammatical structure, unlike English. So there's no evidence here of evolution. What there's evidence is that if you take away the teaching structures, the civilizations that support that level of learning, then people will lose the ability to write. So I would suggest that all those civilizations that exist around the world where there's no writing are probably the result of people having lost the ability to write. I think writing comes with the languages that were given at the Tower of Babel. The oldest recorded history. Again, it's interesting to note that, okay, it's a bit older than what I would expect for the Bible, but the oldest recorded history is still consistent with less than 10,000 years. We don't have evidences of very ancient civilizations. And the issue there is, can we reconcile ancient history to the timeline of the Bible? And probably the most important area to look at, therefore, is the issue of Egypt. Because the ancient world is very much has its chronology, its timeline based around Egyptian chronology, because it seems the most complete. And if we look to the Egyptian chronology, and we look to the works of Velikovsky back in the 1950s, he argued that the timeline that we presently have is wrong. He would have argued that the Exodus, which apparently has no archaeological records and no evidence from Egypt, has got evidence, but we don't look in the right place. So rather than looking for the Exodus to exist in the 18th dynasty or in the Hyksos period, he's saying that we should look to the end of the 13th dynasty, which is often called the end of the Middle Kingdom, and which was when Egypt descended into chaos and was taken over by the Hyksos. And he says if we look there, we will find records of great catastrophes, the Ipuwer papers he refers to. Now, this particular analysis would require Egyptian chronology to be changed by about 500 years, shortened by 500 years. And it produced a lot of interest amongst other archaeologists of Egypt. Now, Velikovsky was an archaeologist. He was actually a psychologist. But he was a learned man. And whilst one could rightly argue whether he's an expert in archaeology, he certainly raised an interesting point. And it wasn't dismissed out of hand by all the archaeologists. In fact, there was a whole group of them set up an organization that produced papers under the title Chronos, and then latterly SIS. And for many years, they debated the points that Velikovsky came up with. They came up with slightly different conclusions to Velikovsky. De Corville in the Exodus problem retains much of Velikovsky's work, but looks back even further into how to reconcile the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. And he does it by methods of having dynasties not successive to each other, but actually in parallel to each other. And his work is well worth reading. More recently, there has been David Rowell, who produced a series for Channel 4 called A Test of Time, in which he locates Joseph, a statue of Joseph, in the Middle Kingdom in the 12th dynasty. And his work has raised a lot of interest. And again, I think he puts the Exodus at the end of the 13th dynasty. And the video Patterns of Evidence, looks at this pattern that you can see of a character like Joseph in a city, wealthy Asiatics, which is the way the Egyptians would refer to people who weren't Egyptian but came from the area of Israel and Levant, and they were referred to as Asiatics. So you can see a pattern here, I think it's avarice. areas where you've got this wealthy Egyptian, not Egyptian, Asiatic, who isn't dressed like an Egyptian and looks very much like he's come from a different part of the world. There is an initial city that is quite wealthy within this big Egyptian city. This city grows, this Asiatic community, and becomes poorer and poorer. And there's evidence of great poverty, which is obviously the shifting from being a favored group to being an oppressed group and eventually slaves. And then suddenly this Asiatic community disappears overnight, which again is consistent with the pattern we see in the Exodus. And then when you parallel that to Canaan, you see that the cities that were found in Canaan are destroyed at this particular period of history, around about the end of the 13th dynasty, just afterwards. And this makes sense of something that Catherine Keenan found when she came to Jericho. When she came to Jericho, she did the initial excavations. They discovered that the walls of Jericho had fallen down. Obviously, it seemed to be like an earthquake. But there was one section that hadn't fallen down, which was consistent with the house that Rahab had. And at first, everyone said, isn't this evidence for the Bible? Until they looked at the chronology and said, no, this is not right. It's in the wrong period. It's sort of 400 to 500 years further away than the Exodus. Therefore, it's just a coincidence. However, if you look at it in terms of a changed Egyptian chronology, or what we call a reduced Egyptian chronology, this makes much more sense. This becomes evidence for the invasion of Canaan by the Israelites. And John Bimson has written on this work and published on that, and he's mentioned in this particular video. Parallel to this, and a different set of work, was something that was produced in the 1990s, The Centuries of Darkness by Peter James, and a number of archaeologists of this period. And this doesn't look at just Egyptian chronology, but it also looks at the chronology of ancient Greece, of Mesopotamia, of Nubia, and all these surrounding areas, because obviously if you're going to change Egyptian chronology, it's going to have an impact on other chronologies in the area. And the question that Peter James says is that possible, and is it desirable? And actually he says it's both possible to change those chronologies by reducing them by 300 years, it's desirable because they have problems which have not been resolved. And they feel that actually, and give you a classic example, it's what's called the Dark Ages for Greece. I finally came across this when I was at school as a 12-year-old doing a project on ancient Greece, and I discovered that you had this amazing civilization on Crete, the Mycenaean civilization, I mean, and then suddenly nothing until you reach the standard age Greek stuff around about the 6th and 7th century BC, and I couldn't understand why there was this gap of about 500 years. And actually was slightly put off it because I couldn't make any sense of this. However, if you take this review that actually there is no gap, that these civilizations are actually side by side, and that gap has been introduced because of a mistaken view of Egyptian chronology, then suddenly you find these dark ages disappear and you have a much more coherent and consistent history of the ancient world. Sadly, I've not been able to see any more recent work on this from James. I would love to see it. And he does have a website, which you can go to, and you just look up Centuries of Darkness and you'll find the website. Certainly an area for further investigation. And I'm not being definite on this. I do realize that if you take the standard chronology of Egypt, there seems to be some anomalies. Now, people like Kenneth Kitchen would argue that's not a problem, and he would say you can reconcile the Bible to the standard chronology of Egypt. I have my doubts. I actually think you do need to change the chronology of Egypt. I'm not an expert on this, and I would love people to do more research on that. But my next talk will be on firmer ground, hopefully, and that will be a talk on ancient Greece, but more particularly a Bible study on the book of Daniel and how that relates to ancient Greece, because ancient Greece is a wonderful place for doing a study on fulfilled prophecy. And so I will now try to close this down.